Hi guys, and welcome to our third video on the Middle Ages revision. So this time we're looking at the life of a peasant or serf, which again is something that can come up in question 4 on the Junior Cert, the People in History question. So to understand this, we're going to again look at our feudal system. As you can see on top is the kings, the lords, the lesser lords, the knights and the peasants. To describe the life of the peasant or the serf, we're going to have to look at two parts of this feudal system. First of all, we're going to look at the lesser lords or the vassals, and secondly, we're going to look at the peasants or the serfs, and these are the guys at the very bottom of the chain. So the peasants and serfs, these people worked on the lord's land, and they paid him in dues, in return for working on the land. There was a difference between a serf and a peasant or a free man. So the serf was tied to the land, so that means he could not leave the land without the lord's permission. And if the lord sold the land, the serf was sold with it. Whereas a free man was technically free to move between estates. So the lord also had judicial rights over the serf. So like we talked about in the lord video, we talked about how they would have court cases in the Great Hall, and how if there was a dispute with the serf, he would be brought in front of the lord in the Great Hall, and the lord would pass judgment. The serfs also had to ask the lords for permission to marry. So who were these lords that they had to ask? A lot of the times we're looking at lesser lords or vassals. So these are people who would have sworn loyalty to those main lords who were just underneath the king. So the lesser lords or vassals, they generally didn't live in the castle that we saw yesterday. They lived in a place called the manor house, and the manor house was usually situated in this small village called a manor. See here we have a little picture of what a medieval Middle Ages manor might look like. So from here you can see where the manor house is. So that's the biggest building in the picture. Okay, also in the village you're going to have a church, and then you're going to have peasants' houses. So they're situated here and here. Okay, so you can see everything is very close to each other. There are other key buildings within this village. Okay, so we're going to look at the blacksmith, we're going to look at the tannery, and we're going to look at the watermill. So again, another sketch. You can see the big manor house there. It's the biggest one there. You can see there's a church. We're also going to look at, you can see there's a blacksmith there, right there, that arrow. Then there's a tannery. So we'll be talking about what a tannery is in a minute, but that would have been in the village. And then you'd have the mill, the watermill. So a blacksmith is someone who works with iron. So he would make things like tools, weapons, locks, even stuff like nails. They would be crucial to a village. Anything, if you needed a plough repaired, if you needed even nails, everything was made there. It wasn't you couldn't go into the shop and buy some nails, or there was some nails lying around. Everything was made by the blacksmith. You also had this place called a tannery. So a tannery was where things were made out of leather. So stuff like shoes and gloves and sandals, all these kind of things. And they would be made by the tanner. And another important function or building within these little villages was the watermill. So the watermill usually belonged to the lord of the manor, and the peasants would have to pay him to use it to grind their wheat into flour. So the peasants would be paying dues, and they'd have to work for the lord, but they'd also have to pay him to use the watermill so that they could grind their crops into flour to help make bread. You can see here how the watermill works. You can see the arrow as it comes in there. The water comes down and it turns. So it's like a primitive hydroelectricity. It turns the thing there, and then that's going to grind down, kind of like a cairn on top. So then what we're going to look at now, we've looked at some of the buildings, now we're going to look at the land of the village. So the land within the village is usually divided up into 3 areas. So you have the Demense, you have the open fields, and you have the commons. Now the Demense, this was the lord's own land, and it was usually walled off from the rest of the village. Peasants had to work on the lord's land for 3 days a week. So anything that was on that land was the lord's. Then our second kind of part of the land in this time would be the open field system. So it's usually divided into 3 fields, okay? So one would be left fallow, okay? So fallow means that nothing was planted there for a year. You can see here on the top right hand side, there was nothing planted there. And every year they'd swap the field in which they planted nothing because they thought that it would give the land a bit of a chance to recover. And then the other 2 would be planted in. There's a wheat, rye field there, and there's an oats and beans field. And so these open fields would be divided into columns or strips, and each peasant would have a few rows, and that's where they get their crops for the year from. The final part of the division of the land within these little villages was the commons. So this land belonged to all the village, and their animals were there and they were left to graze. So you didn't have to have your own field. Everyone used this commons area. Another aspect of peasant life was taxes. So we talked about how they had to pay the lord dues. So that would be usually payment in kind. They would give some over some of their crops. They would also give over some of their work. They'd spend 3 days out of the week working on the lord's Demense, on his fields, on things for him. They had to pay for use of the watermill, but they also had to pay this tax called a tithe. So the tithe was a tax paid by peasants to produce to the church. So they had to give 1/10 of all they produced of the year. They had to give to the church. You can see here another picture of what a manor looks like. Again, you can see up there, number 1 is where the manor house was. But within this, you're also going to see a thing called a tithe barn. Okay, so that is the thing that's just dropped in there. It's behind the church, and it was literally a barn whereby all the crops that the peasants had given to the church as part of their tithe would be kept in this barn behind the church. Now, it wasn't all doom and gloom. It was a lot of work, and there wasn't much of a social life for these people. But there were certain things they did enjoy. So one of the entertaining things that they enjoyed was cockfighting, where they get 2 hens and they would fight with each other, and they would bet on it, and it was a source of entertainment. Absolutely brutal, and banned in most countries now due to the brutality of it. But that would have been one of their sources of entertainment. Another source of entertainment was wrestling. So they would have had competitions of strength. They would have had an audience around. 2 men would get in and they'd wrestle. There's also, within the Middle Ages, was where soccer developed. They used to have games that spanned the entire village. You would kick the ball from one village to the other village, and that's how you'd score your goals. A final little thing I want to add about the life of a serf is a serf could become a free man if he escaped from a year and a day without being captured. So if a serf left and he wasn't captured or seen for a year and a day, then he had earned his own freedom. But if he was found, he would be brought in front of the court. He might be made to pay a massive fine. He might be put in the dungeon. Okay, and we will work on all these aspects of a serf's life tomorrow.